Procurement documents. The documents that are associated with the procurement process lay the foundation for vendor relationships. They apply to the selected vendors and for those who are considering the work. An ideal procurement document answers the questions of the potential buyer and allows them to make a well-planned bid, which of course helps create a win-win relationship with the seller. PMI and Pete Matassa both agree that you want a win-win relationship. My experience has been that whenever you really make it one-sided, the seller cuts corners that you don't want them to cut. Again, every organization usually has their own names for these documents. If you call them something different where you work, continue to do that at work, but when you take the test, these are the definitions you're going to use. Request for quote. Typically, we use requests for quotes to solicit proposals for small dollar amount items. Think shrink wrap commodity items that don't require a great deal of customization. A request for quote just requests a price for a standard item. There's an assumption we're probably not going to do any negotiations on this. So an example would be a request for prospective sellers wishing to provide pricing for customer established server criteria. 80 XYZ servers with 6 gig of RAM, 20 terabyte of hard drive, and I want them on my dock in 120 days. What's the best deal you can give me? Request for information is typically used to solicit information to learn more about a company that could provide the service for the buyer. Often, if you have a contract with any heft at all to it, you want to be ensured that whoever wins the contract can actually perform. For vendors you haven't dealt with in the past, you might ask them for a request for information, which is essentially their resume, shows that they've done similar work and tells you who they've done it for. An example, a request from state government to see if a consulting company has the appropriate experience in the area to bid for a potential project. Request for proposal, also called a request for tender. Usually these contracts are for very complex projects. Generally, the seller has to provide a detailed approach to how they're going to do it. It's a document that requests an approach, a price, and significant detail. Often, the seller will provide a pro forma schedule, will provide a detailed pro forma budget, and say in detail what they expect to do. Also, because of the complexity of these types of contracts, it's assumed that there's going to be some negotiation after the award to fine-tune it. An example, a request for a proposal to prospective sellers for design, implementation, and training for a data warehouse to consolidate 5 different enterprise databases at a Fortune 500 company. Invitation for bid, also called a request for bid. This is basically the same thing as a request for proposal, except it's a sealed bid. Usually it's done for government contracts. Qualified sellers list. Qualified sellers list is a list that a buyer can use as a screening mechanism. It has the advantages of providing the buyer with pre-screened vendors who have been approved by the organization's procurement department. Whenever somebody came to my office trying to sell me something, my first question was, are you on the qualified sellers list? If they said no, I would tell them, well, you need to get on it and then come back and talk to me. As a department head who's purchasing anything or a project manager who's purchasing anything, using a qualified sellers list is not only safer, it also makes sense. A bidders conference. Typically, if you have a proposal or you're soliciting proposals for a project that's reasonably complex or for part of a project that's going to be reasonably complex, it's a good idea to have a bidders conference. The point of a bidders conference is really twofold. It's one, to make sure that any prospective bidder can ask any question for clarification, and it's to make sure that all the bidders can see all the answers so that everybody can provide the best bid possible. So there's usually a little formal presentation by the buyer specifying what they're after. At that point, all the sellers can ask questions and the answers are made available to all the potential bidders. Historically, this has been done in person. More and more through the technology, we're using a webinar type of environment. Things that need to be kept in mind when you're doing a bidders conference: the buyer needs to take all steps they can to ensure there's no collusion among the sellers. And the buyer also has to make sure that every bidder gets to see all the questions and all the answers. Again, we're trying to allow everybody to make the best bid possible. Non-competitive forms of procurement. On this exam, you're held accountable for two types of non-competitive procurement: single source and sole source. In a non-competitive procurement, you award a contract without any bidding. In a sole source scenario, you're dealing with a vendor who's the only vendor that can do this. They either have a monopoly or they've got a proprietary methodology that nobody else is aware of. In a single source contract, you're choosing a partner you prefer to work with, and you're not putting it out for competition. If you're going to do single source, a couple things to keep in mind. You've got to ensure there's no silly pricing or overpricing. And two, there cannot even be a hint of impropriety. Always, I'd want to use somebody that's on my qualified sellers list. And honestly, if my sister-in-law had a company that I knew did great work and they were on the qualified sellers list, I would not hire her company just because it doesn't look good. So there can be no impropriety. There can be no overpricing. The contract management plan is a sub-plan of the procurement plan that defines the rules for archiving contract documentation. It establishes payments for the work of the contract. It addresses changes to the contract. It validates that the work of the contract is complete. And it talks about how you're going to close the contract when it's complete. We already talked about incentive fees. Incentive fees are fees that are given to a seller if they do something that's not in the contract that they're requested to do. They don't have to do it, but if they do it, they will get extra compensation. Negotiations. Let's talk about a couple of negotiating strategies.